We have a powerful image in our first reading today from the prophet Ezekiel. And it says that the Lord appointed Ezekiel as the watchman of Israel. What does a watchman do? The watchman in the ancient world was the guardian of the city. He'd be up in a high tower or on a cliffside where he could see a long distance, and he'd be watching, ready to warn people in the city if there is danger. If there were outlaws outside of the city walls, or if there was an army advancing on the city, the watchman would be the first one to see and alert the people. Or if there was a fire that broke out in the city, he would be the one watching and he would sound the alarm. And, it would give people time to react. If it was an army, it would give them time to close the gates off and get some soldiers up on the walls so they could defend themselves. The watchman would be on the lookout day and night. I think the modern day equivalent would probably be radar. Our military is constantly monitoring the borders of our country, making sure that no Russians enter into the airspace, or they're monitoring whether there's missiles fired. And we can just go about our ordinary life and not worry about any of that stuff. We don't have to worry about missiles coming in or any risks like that, because there's people in the background who are watching over us. There's a tremendous responsibility on the part of a watchman. Watchmen cannot fall asleep on the job because people's lives are at stake. And for the people who are in the city, if the watchman sounds the alarm, you better listen. You don't ignore the watchman. When the watchman cries out, you stop what you're doing and you react because it's important. And so Ezekiel's mission was not a physical watchman of the city, but to warn the people of the moral evil that they had fallen into and how they were offending God and how it was going to lead to their destruction. They were worshiping false gods. They embraced immorality. They were rejecting God's laws, and they figured they were okay because God would never destroy the city of Jerusalem. And so he was sent to warn the people as a watchman. As we look at the gospel today, Jesus is instructing his apostles. And the gospel is not, it's not Christ talking to thousands and thousands of listeners. He wasn't preaching this to the crowd. He's specifically talking to the 12, who were the first bishops. And he tells them to be watching over the morality of others. And he gives them a method of correction if people are falling into immorality. And he also gives them the authority to bind and loose. What you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. What you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And binding and loosing refers to a number of things. But one of the things that it refers to is moral teaching. What morality binds us, or what we're bound to do according to morality, or what we're loosed from, what we're not obligated to do. And so what Jesus is doing in the gospel is he's basically appointing the apostles as the first bishops, as watchmen. And that's the connection between our first reading and the gospel. Jesus is giving the responsibility to the first bishops and to the church to be the watchmen, to provide moral teaching and moral guidance for people. I want to imagine for a second a city without a watchman. It'd probably be fine for a while. But for the people in the city, they would probably forget about the possibility of danger. They'd probably just, go about their daily lives, talking with their friends, working, going to the market, doing their daily chores. They would go on with life and probably not be thinking at all that there's a possibility of an enemy invasion. Who would be sitting there thinking in their daily life, is an enemy attacking? But that's the job of the watchman. And so for ordinary people, if they didn't have a watchman in their city, they would be defenseless. Most people today are living that way morally. They've rejected organized religion and basically just set off on their own, thinking that they don't need anyone to give them any guidance. They don't need a moral voice, and nobody is guarding them. They're completely vulnerable. And people are just doing their own thing, unaware that the armies of darkness are descending upon them, and that the enemy is on the attack. And that whether we realize it or not, we're in the midst of a bitter struggle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And our souls are the battleground. And the enemy is attacking relentlessly. And the enemy tries to distort our thinking. They have different tactics, temptation, but a lot of things that they try and do are to distort our way of thinking, to twist our view of reality, to soften our consciences. They want us to think that the moral teachings aren't that big of a deal. And if we do fall into sin, it doesn't matter that much. It's not that bad. You can go ahead and do this. Other people are doing this. The enemy wants to soften our consciences. And often they convince people that we can decide for ourselves what's right and wrong, that we don't need anyone telling us what to do. And so what happens is people's view of the church becomes distorted, and they view the church as something that's oppressive or burdensome. But that's not the way God intends the church. That's not the way God sees it. God sees, and the mission of the church is to be the voice of truth. As St. Paul says, the church is the pillar and bulwark of truth. And so Jesus Christ gives us the church not in order to put oppressive hardships upon us, but he gives us the church out of love. He's giving us a watchman so that we have people who are watching over us, people who are watching over our morality and teaching us. Each week we can come to Mass and hear moral teachings to guide us. He gives us the church so that we have the voice of truth and a watchman who's watching over us to guard us. A voice that tells us not what we want to hear, as so many voices do in the world, but the voice that speaks the truth. The mission of the church is the salvation of souls. And so what the church speaks to us is truth motivated by a desire for our salvation. In a relativistic culture, people will dismiss anything that they don't agree with. They want to decide for themselves what's right or wrong, and they don't want to be held bound by any truth beyond themselves. And that's a lot like the people of Jerusalem that Ezekiel was sent to. But they ignored Ezekiel to their own destruction. The city was destroyed. For us, it's important for us not to ignore the voice of truth. Often the world doesn't want to hear about the virtue of purity. They don't want to hear about couples being open to life. They don't want to hear about the importance of worshiping the Lord on the Lord's day. They don't want to hear about these things. But that's the voice of truth. And we shouldn't be quick to ignore the voice of the watchman, because the watchman's there not just to put burdens upon us. The watchman isn't there to lie to us. The watchman is there to speak the word of truth to us for the sake of our salvation. It's okay if there's moral teachings that we don't understand, in which case we need to seek a deeper understanding and seek to understand the wisdom of the church. But we should never disregard the voice of truth. And so as we reflect upon these readings, I think it's important for us to recognize the critical mission that the church has in each one of our lives, and to be grateful for the teachings of the church, and to be grateful that we have a watchman who's watching over us in order to protect us and to guide us on the path to salvation.